In this episode of Hidden Treasures, we will learn about the hymn Fi Etaf Inf. This is also known as the Hymn of the Cross. Fi Etaf Inf is chanted during the following occasions: Matins of Covenant Thursday, the 6th and the 9th hour of Great Friday, the Feast of the Cross, and the funerals of all clergy members. Let's first take a look at the meaning of the words of the hymn. "This is he who offered himself" is the first part of this hymn, and in the Old Testament, priests were the only people allowed to offer sacrifices on account of people's sins. Christ offering himself affirms his high priesthood. In the Old Testament, the sinner would place his hand on the head of the sacrifice so that the sin would be carried by the pure sacrifice. Christ carried the sins of all people from the beginning of time until now. He carried it all in the Garden of Gethsemane, which raised his blood pressure to the point of his sweat becoming like blood. He raised himself up on the cross like the sacrifices of the Old Testament were carried up on the altar. This is to describe the height and the breadth and the completion of God's love for us. This is why he came to earth, to raise himself up on the cross and to die on our behalf. He offered himself up of his own will. We must keep all of this in mind when we're chanting this hymn, to remember the emotion and the weight of Christ's sacrifice for us. An acceptable sacrifice. Christ's sacrifice was the only true and acceptable sacrifice capable of our salvation. This is because of the nature of our sin against God and the nature of Christ himself. The only sacrifice that was truly acceptable on our behalf had to fulfill the following requirements: had to be human, had to be perfect, and had to be infinite. Christ, in his offering of himself, fulfilled the three requirements of the acceptable sacrifice for our salvation. Upon the cross, our Lord Jesus Christ's death on the cross was a fulfillment of the prophecies. The Son of Man had to be lifted up. The cross was the altar made of wood that our Lord offered himself on. In the Old Testament, the cross was a symbol of damnation, but after the crucifixion of our Lord Jesus Christ, it became a symbol of pride. This is why after the crucifixion, crosses were no longer only made of wood, but of silver, gold, precious stones, and metals. The cross is the altar on which was offered the sacrifice for all of humanity. In its appearance, it is weakness, but the reality is that it's the sign of what is greater than power. For the salvation of our race. The sacrifices of the Old Testament were merely for the forgiveness of sins. However, Christ's offering gave not only forgiveness, but salvation. St. John Chrysostom teaches us it is the redemption, the reconciliation, and the resurrection that together result for us in salvation. We are saved from the consequence of sin, and at last we're able to enter into paradise. His good Father smelled him in the evening on Golgotha. It is the pleasing aroma of incense that caused God to establish a covenant with mankind to never destroy them again. The Church is declaring in awe the fact that God the Father has accepted our prayers and has accepted the sacrifice offered before him. We come full circle now and marvel at all that this hymn contains. Truly it is a story of our redemption, put in very simple words. Christ our God, whom the prophets foretold, came to earth, took on our humanity while remaining God, suffered and died, buried and rose, and was found as an unblemished sacrifice before God the Father, and hence reconciled us with God, redeemed us, and granted us salvation. Join us in part 2 of this episode, where we will go over the musicality of Phi, Etaf, and